In 2005, the world bare witness to Peter Jackson's King Kong and his rendition of Skull Island, a brutal hellscape where man is just one of many prey species for the island's delightful cast of horrors. A host of specimens collected from bygone eras and the unforgiving tropical environment makes this version of Skull Island a truly dreadful place to call home. Yet, the new world is host to many such terrors, and none perhaps as belligerent as the relentless Ruffian Anjanath. A formidable predator that dominates and subjugates those below it in the food chain. Its burning desire to become the apex predator of the ancient forests, suppressed by the king of the skies, Rathalos. In its native lands, Anjanath can never dream of accomplishing its goals. Yet, could its tenacity and brutality prove enough to conquer the horrors of Skull Island? Join me as I endeavor to find out by judging the brute wyvern's ability to adapt to the environment, handle prey, and deal with competitors/predators in my next installment of Evolutionary Arms Race. Yep, that's what I'm calling this totally original series of mine. By the way, if you're interested in content like this, consider checking out my last episode on this series, where I cover Legicris's chances of surviving the unforgiving oceans of planet 4546b. And if you're interested in Monster Hunter lore in general, consider checking out some of my other content. As of late, I've been scaling both in and out of universe the forbidden monsters. So, if you'd like to learn more about the strongest monsters in the setting, definitely give it a watch. Other than that, let's just jump straight into the video. You know the rules. A population of this time 50 adult individuals will be tasked to set up a functional breeding population. Most hover around the average size of 16.5 meters in length and a mass of 45.5 metric tons, joining the ranks as some of the island's most massive megafauna. But will their sheer size alone be enough to protect them? Let's find out by venturing far out into the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where we'll find an island lost to time. Skull Island is a sinking abyss that's subdivided into 6 major biomes. To assess whether or not our group of invaders have what it takes to make it in these lands, we'll have to determine how well they can confront the challenges of each region. We'll round up our score at the end of the video, where I'll give my final verdict. First up, you'd be remiss for thinking the coastline would function as a reprieve from many of the island's ills. However, you'd be incorrect, as the coast offers no such respite. Both the environment and fauna are equally unforgiving. To conquer such lands, our invaders must first be adept at handling the shore's rugged terrain. For you see, Skull Island isn't home to many beaches. Instead, its shoreline is dominated by crumbling cliffs and promontories that jut out over an unruly ocean. The jagged projections are assaulted daily by waves strong enough to sweep away all but the sternest of grips. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, the eastern shoreline is a massive estuary where one wrong footstep can cause you to sink into its smooth soils. So, is there any evidence Anjanath can handle such merciless terrain? Well, yes. On the western edge of the ancient forest, for example, the Fierce Jaw Wyverns can be spotted leaping between cliff sides. On top of that, the forest's arboreal architecture demands that its inhabitants master its vertical layout, with Anjanath's forelimbs evolving to help its powerful hind limbs to climb. Then how about the ever-sinking estuary? Would it be a death trap for the muscle-bound brutes? Well, if Rice's environmental distribution is anything to go by, which admittedly it might not, wetlands aren't an unassailable barrier to our group of invaders, as the wyverns can be spotted patrolling the old world's flooded forests. Even in the new world, the Wildspire Waste, which Anjanath frequents, is home to a marshland. However, an important thing to note is that while the wyverns might be adept at traversing the terrain, it's not the one they're best equipped to hunt in. Instead, they seemingly prefer clearings with patches of dense vegetation that they can use to launch an ambush. Yet, rugged terrain isn't the only danger to be found on the shores of Skull Island. The assorted beasts that call these lands home aren't so welcoming to visitors. Admittedly, most don't possess any form of viable retaliation against the sheer power of even a juvenile Anjanath. Although I'm sure the populations of native crustaceans, amphibians, and prehistoric wildlife could probably use their superior mastery over the coast to effectively hide or run away. For an Anjanath, then, the more challenging venture is finding prey that's both calorically worthwhile and easy enough to catch. An unusual yet suitable match could be the washed up remains of marine megafauna that frequent the island's waters, with the wyverns likely locating these carcasses rather quickly, as their ability to unfurl their nostrils boosts their sense of smell to such a degree that they can accurately pinpoint the location and distance of their prey, allowing the brutes to lay claim to these indispensable resources before anyone else. This would, however, put them in direct competition with the island's native coastal apex predator, Tartarosaurus. At 6.1 to 8.5 meters in length, the lumbering apexes are described as being able to deliver bone-crushing bites and outsprinting men in short bursts. Their thick, rhinoceros-like hide also protects them from lacerations caused by intraspecific competition with their sickle claws. Despite all of that, Tartarosaurus would still get mauled by a fully grown Anjanath. However, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that juvenile wyvern may become part of their menu. The only other predators that might potentially be threatening to very young wyvern are Dirosuchus, the dire croc, Nefundosaurus, and the tribes of natives that call Skull Island home. A young wyvern in search of prey like the shellfish-devouring Aciodactylus may inadvertently become the victim of an ambush launched by a Dirosuchus, or have its kill stolen by the even larger Nefundosaurus, lest it become food itself. The natives would likely cower in fear of the wyverns, but may decide to eliminate youngsters in the hopes of dispatching future threats. Given the low levels of suitable prey items and less than ideal terrain, I think the wyverns would abandon this place rather quickly, only seeing use by visitors looking to score an easy meal with the dried up remains of whale carcasses, or juveniles looking to avoid the steeper competition of the rest of the island, yet finding themselves being hunted by coastal predators, relying on their superior arboreal mobility to keep them out of harm's way and to gain access to resources like the colonies of seabird eggs. And so, like most of our brutish invaders, let's move on to greener pastures. The labyrinthine jungles of Skull Island are amongst the most impressive in the known world. Trees as tall as skyscrapers litter the place, with branching networks so complex they're fully fledged ecosystems all on their own. If any environment on the archipelago resembled the wyvern's native home of the ancient forests, it'd be Skull Island's steaming jungles. Our group of relentless ruffians would feel completely at ease in the dense vegetation, using their powerful olfactory senses to guide them through the maze-like forest, with their coat of feathers and capillary-rich sails aiding in thermoregulation to assist in dealing with the high temperatures, and their translucent skin sucking up the moisture given off by the extreme humidity. However, is there any incentive for our invaders to bother to stick around for? Well, surprisingly, yeah. The jungles of Skull Island have the second largest array of megafauna in the archipelago. Here you'll find the likes of giants like Aspertosaurus, Atychirosaurus, Avarasaurus, and Diablosaurus. These megafaunal herbivores, or in the case of Avarasaurus, omnivore, will serve as the main diet of the jungle Anjanath population. Not to imply these denizens would come free of charge, of course. Whilst Avarasaurus' offensive posturing might not work against the far more powerful brute wyvern, on the opposite side of the spectrum, Atychirosaurus' and Diablosaurus' herding behavior may prove indispensable, functioning similarly to Apteros' defensive wall, which, while not reflected in game super well, is an effective anti-predator mechanism according to the lore, meaning our Anjanaths will have to rely on their display structures and vocalizations to flush out these herds, like they do against Aptonoth in the New World. Finally, Aspertosaurus has a whip-like tail that can snap trees just as easily as bone, and spiny skeletal protrusions that make finding a weak spot difficult. One wrong choice and you run the risk of getting impaled. Even the brute wyverns will have to be calculating in their attempts to take down prey this dangerous, leaving us with competitors as the final obstacle. Once again, there's a whole host of unique specimens far too small to pose a threat to a fully grown Anjanath. Yet if any environment would host clutches of Anjanath chicks, it'd be this one. And with no evidence of parental care on Anjanath's part, these chicks would be treated in the same way as the rest of Skull Island's hatchlings, that being fodder for the jungle's host of specialist baby killers, like the multiple species of giant ground centipedes, egg-thieving Aldalposaurus, and ginormous Sticholithus, as well as snacks for the jungle's assorted cast of opportunists. Even juvenile Anjanath could reasonably fall prey to the bone-crushing Photodon, packs of Venatosaurus, and the mated pairs of Caracaptors. In their youth, the wyverns could dine upon the jungle's smaller herbivores like the multiple species of giant flightless birds, the generalist Monstrolops, the hard-to-put-down Herbisaurus, and the belligerent Gar. Although the fleet-footed Silverceratops and foul-smelling Pinatono would likely stay out of harm's reach, especially the Pinatono, as its vomit projectiles would be especially effective against the sensitive noses of the wyverns. This would, however, put them in direct competition with juvenile V-Rexes, who also call the jungle home for the first few years of their life. Less bulky than their adult selves and more so built for speed, these juvenile delinquents are known to be gregarious. Unfortunately for the wyverns, their intimidation display structures, as theorized per Iceborne's edition of Monster Hunter Superbiology Report, would likely be lost on the theropods in a similar fashion to how the delinquents ignore the warning calls of Venatisauruses.
Well, what I'm saying is that there are known knowns and that there are known unknowns, but there's also unknown unknowns. Things we don't know that we don't know.
What?
Leading to inevitable conflict, and due to the lack of knowledge on the ecology of juvenile Anjanath outside of their apparent fluffiness, I'm leaning on juvenile V-Rexes outcompeting the brutes due to their gregariousness, at least until the wyverns learn to wield their fire element. Yet all of this hardship would be turned upside down once the wyverns hit maturity, with a fully grown Anjanath as the undisputed ruler of the jungle. Even Venatosaurus packs, which are capable of taking down Brontosauruses, can't do much to retaliate, as the wyvern's more belligerent attitude would keep it from falling for the same trap. Its ability to breathe fire and imposing structures would also break the composure of any pack. Finally, while carvers are massive, they're still not enough and would likely get manhandled worse than, say, a Tobi-Kadachi. All in all, the jungles of Skull Island would serve as a familiar home to our group of invaders, but so far, adult Anjanath haven't had to worry about much. Let's change that by traveling into On the eastern side of the mountainous spine that bisects Skull Island is a network of rivers fed by runoff and spring that weaves through a wide land of gentle country swath in low shrub and patchy grasslands. These regions are home to the largest collection of megafauna on the island, and thus represent keen territories for our group of invaders. Although vastly different from their native home of the ancient forests, there's reason to believe these lowlands wouldn't present an insurmountable obstacle. For one, it's explicitly mentioned that Anjanath's boldness is what has allowed them to successfully expand their territory in the old world, showing off the wyvern's adaptability. It also shows that Anjanath can live in far more open country, with their native locale and rise being the sandy plains, a mixed savanna desert. However, whether possible or not doesn't matter if there's no enticing prospect to move in for. Luckily for the Fierce Jaw Wyverns, the lowlands offer up the greatest banquet the island has to offer, from the Aptonoth-like Ligocristus, Maltempered Feructus, and ginormous Brontosaurus. Each and every one of these species in its own right could sustain a population of the wyverns, but put together offer up an irresistible banquet. The only problem is that these herbivores aren't defenseless. Ligocristus, while carrying less weaponry than a similarly sized Aptonoth, is far faster, meaning Anjanath will have to be a lot more calculating if they so wish to catch one. They could attempt to flush out a herd, but with far more open terrain, I don't see that strategy working out so well. On the opposite side of the spectrum, Feructus bulls guard their harems fiercely, capable of warding off T-Rexes reliably. They stand a good chance against the wyverns in a 1v1, let alone as a herd. Finally, an adult Brontosaurus might be the only creature on the island capable of overpowering the wyverns consistently. This isn't to say that the wyverns wouldn't try their luck with decoy males or females, but just that they would have to be cautious around such mature individuals. Of course, the brutes do possess the ability to breathe fire, but this ability isn't used in hunting. Rather, the wyverns are seen using their iron jaws and strong neck muscles to thrash about their prey. Some Anjanath have even demonstrated cunning whilst grappling with more troublesome opponents by purposely outflanking their victims, a strategy that they may decide to employ against the charge-happy Fructus to great effect. Overall, whilst challenging, I do believe the Fierce Jaw Wyverns would learn to reliably predate the hardiest residents of Skull Island. That's if they can manage to overthrow the current monarchs of Skull Island's lowlands, Vastatosaurus Rex. AKA the Ravager Lizard King, are the undisputed apex predators of Skull Island. Nearly as large as the wyverns, yet filled to the brim with osteoderms, these tyrants, similarly to their youth, occupy the same ecological niche as the wyverns, except, unlike their formative years, are bulky and mostly solitary, only becoming gregarious around the mating season. Having learned from their oblivious infancy, the tyrants now mostly settle conflicts through shouting matches and posturing, meaning the display structures Anjanath possess would give them a distinct advantage in these sorts of confrontations. However, the wyverns are far less forgiving than their dinosaurian counterparts, being prone to preemptively attack competitors. Given their reach advantage, more calculating nature, and ability to breathe fire, these fights would more than likely slant in their favor. However, this may force T-Rexes to respond by becoming more gregarious. A duo, or as seen in the movie, trio of T-Rexes will definitely prove to be too much for one wyvern, although I could see Anjanaths making safe retreats from T-Rex pairs given their more versatile weaponry, with their sharpened back feathers offering up great rear defense. It ultimately comes down to whether or not T-Rexes as a species are adaptable enough to incorporate gregariousness in adults, and whilst far from impossible, I think their likely low genetic diversity and shrinking ecosystems would hamper their adaptability far too much, forcing the species to slowly be outcompeted by the new wyvern residents. Having supplanted the local apex, all the Anjanaths would now have to worry about would be the groups of scavengers looking to pry open their kills. Most could be easily warded off, but the ornate carrion beetle is an extreme counter to the wyverns, their hypersensitive noses being incredibly vulnerable against the beetle's cocktail of noxious chemicals, with the wyverns quickly learning to abandon any kills stolen by said insects. There are groups of critters that may function as light snacks for any wandering wyverns, but perhaps none as satiating as the lowlands' flightless birds. All in all, the lowlands are a phenomenal banquet for the Relentless Ruffians. However, having established themselves as the local apex predators doesn't mean our invaders have truly conquered the island, and what's left is some of the most gruesome locales ever cooked up for film, and no environment embodies that perhaps more than... Near the center of the largest island on the Skull Island archipelago exists an enormous reservoir of fresh water. The yearly downpours that touch these lands have formed deep channels that feed a multitude of lakes, streams, rivers, and ponds. Miniature land masses are scattered about the mangrove forest that grows here. The earth is filled with moisture, making solid ground its own invaluable resource. Needless to say, none of this sounds like the ideal stomping grounds of an Anjanath. Even in the wetlands, where the wyverns can be seen frequenting, they typically prefer to stick to firmer ground. Whilst their translucent skin would be able to deal rather well with the high humidity, it's also a double-edged sword that opens up the brutes to a whole host of parasites, from massive blood-sucking native mosquito species to many aquatic pathogens unique to Skull Island's waterways. Amongst them are the ectoparasites like Estrovermis and Profanus, worms that anchor themselves to their hosts and leech off of them. Contorobestiola are little invertebrates that infest their victims' gastrointestinal tract, and Custacetus, which, similarly to the worms, creates a scab-like wound upon which it anchors itself and feeds from. Fortunately for the Anjanaths, their predominantly land-dwelling lifestyle would make them less than ideal hosts for many of the nastier aquatic parasites. Yet I don't doubt any wyvern swimming in search of prey amongst these waterways would fall victim. Yet one incentive would drive our invaders to such a horrid place. Well, I can tell you now, it's not any of the small amphibians, invertebrates, birds, dromaeosaurs, or even whatever the fuck this is.
Hey!
Yeah?
What the hell is this?
No, the real incentives are first the herds of Malamagnus. Hippo-like reptiles native to Skull Island, both in size, build, and somewhat ecology, they're reminiscent of Slagtoff, a known prey species of the wyverns. Catching herds of them off guard will prove difficult, as they're already cautious of large predators like Anjanath, with their instinct to run towards deeper water being as effective against Anjanath as it is against any V-Rex. Yet, I said there were two primary incentives. The second, and more powerful one, would be the herds of female Legocristis that have learned to exploit Skull Island's waterways as nurseries. Now this would be easier said than done, but with their powerful olfactory senses, I could see Anjanaths eventually trailing back these herds to their nesting grounds, in which they could take advantage of returning and exhausted females. Yet, if the Fierce Jaw Wyvern seek to exploit such resources, it'll come at a cost. Luckily for Anjanath, their sheer bulk would intimidate most competitors outright. Yet two potential death traps still exist. The first are the island's colonies of killer eels. These piranha-like lamprey fish will tear apart wounded animals in a matter of minutes. If a wounded Anjanath finds itself in the midst of such colonies, there's unfortunately not much it can do to retaliate. Beyond praying, it can make it to solid ground in time. The other danger comes in the form of the waterway's true apex predator, Pteranodon. These whale-sized fish have taken over Crocodilian's niche of semi-aquatic ambush predators, with their massive sensory organs letting them know when to strike. One bite from these critters could seriously injure even an adult wyvern. Now in a typical ambush, I actually favor the Anjanath, as the brute is in a good spot to retaliate. Think of a similar yet more one-sided version of Duratodus' turf war with Baroff. However, if Pteranodon catches an Anjanath in a similar situation as one did the crew of the USS Venture, then...
Well. How the turntables...
See, without its elemental attacks and ability to leverage aground, I don't see Anjanath beating the far more agile and at-home Pteranodon. You also have to consider that any Anjanath this deep in Skull Island's waterways is likely riddled with parasites, and thus not in tip-top condition. Given all these factors, I do favor the fish in these pursuits more often than not. Overall, the waterways of Skull Island are likely to be sparsely populated by our invaders, more than likely existing as seasonal banquets that come with many risks. At least it can't get much worse than this. Latticing the southern half of Skull Island are deep fissures and chasms, the result of violent quakes and water erosion. Deep springs disgorge tepid water that mixes with the dripping fluid and rot from the surface, creating a steamy soup rich in minerals and thick with organic slop. Flooded by rains and nourished by geothermal upswellings, these abyssal rents and blisters in the crust of the island are worlds unto themselves. Now, being up front, Anjanath isn't surviving down here for long. To be fair, we do see Fulgur Anjanath surviving in the similarly derelict Rotten Vale. However, not only does the subspecies seem more adaptable, considering their status as invaders, but the Rotten Vale is far richer in biomass than the chasms of Skull Island. At best, I could see an Anjanath traversing these chasms out of curiosity or a potential resting spot, but the lack of sufficient biomass would keep them from venturing deep into its abyss. Any Anjanath unfortunate enough to fall in these chasms would be in for a bad time. Its strong body would likely keep it from immediately dying upon impact, yet if sufficiently crippled, the chasm's assorted cast of scavengers would have a field day. From the repulsive Carnictus broods to the unsatiable swarms of Waterways, ginormous deplectors, opportunistic Arachnocetus, and colonies of Apsides. All of these invertebrate scavengers would swarm and slowly decompose the still living wyvern. If still capable of defending itself, the wyvern's fiery breath would act as a good deterrent to the broods of horrid insects, allowing its superb climbing abilities and sense of smell to lead it out of these hellish chasms. The only other thing of note would be theorizing if Anjanath would view the chasms in a similar light as the Rotten Vale, a graveyard to migrate to in its final years of life. If so, the inhabitants of the chasms will likely be welcome with a pretty reliable feast year-round. Although there's a reason to believe the death of a sufficiently large elder dragon is a necessary trigger for such an environment, as the old world populations of the brute wyverns exhibit no such behavior. And with that, we're left with only one region to examine, that being the King of Skull Island's Royal Keep. Rising above the green shag of the jungle, the mountainous spine of Skull Island is home to some of its most ancient refugees. Though due to the difficulty of mountainous life, most of the residents of the highlands stand no chance against the brute wyverns in a one-on-one brawl. Rather, they'll have to rely on their sure-footedness to help them escape the clutches of our dastardly invaders. Species like the gracile Bifurcatops and agile Sardis could run circles around the wyverns and aren't even calorically worthwhile. Herds of Shalitops during the mating season might pose an interesting proposition, though the larger Malevolsaurus would be even more enticing, yet due to their patchy population density would be hard to subsist out of. To a lesser extent, the same goes for the bear crocs, as their loud vocalizations give away their position. The regional apex, Gladiodon, would find the intrusion of Anjanaths troublesome, but likely not existential, as without a more substantive food source than just the seasonal herds of Shalitops, the wyverns will simply not stick around for long enough to have an impactful presence. At most, the jungle populations may come up during the morning to bask in the early morning sun. Raiding the colonies of Pteropomordax might at first sound like just the banquet needed to make the wyverns stick around, until you remember that these colonies have a smell so rancid that it causes most creatures' eyes to water and nostrils to burn.
Get the dead rat out? I don't need to anymore, it doesn't smell bad. The thing is, I used to use a dead rat as an alarm clock, actually, for my stream, because basically what happened was, whenever the sun would come up, it would start cooking the corpse of the rat, and then it would start smelling again, and then the smell would wake me up. So I would use the rat effectively as an alarm clock, and as soon as it got hot enough, it would wake me up, and then I would know, oh shit, it's time to stream. Have you guys ever done that before? Yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, I mean, you guys know what it is. Yeah, it is what it is, right, guys? Yeah, it is what it is. You're an inspiration to us all? Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. And anyway...
However, one last species presents an irresistible temptation to our group of invaders. Megaprimatus Kong.
Socks, I really do like your channel, but
Where the fuck is the power scaling?
this video is complete dog shit. You have Kong's
Cock shoved so far up your ass, you've become delirious.
I mean, do you really think wooden log level fodder like fucking Pteranodon can damage Anjanath, who clearly upscales from Kongalala, who can scrap with Joe, making him at least
Baseline universal.
Now the unemployed might have noticed the seeming lack of power scaling in this video, with me making plenty of declarative statements about which megafauna could stand up to the brute wyverns, and which couldn't. Well, before you leave that lovely comment of yours, let me explain why I structured the video the way that I did. See, most of the relevant calcs for the 2005 Kong verse are related to the main man himself. So instead of making 10 different short videos scaling the various creatures of Skull Island, I've just decided to reserve the scaling portion of this video for the very end. And you can use this tier list right here to see where I think the various fauna of Skull Island scale in relation to Kong. That way, after I'm done scaling the king, you can reference back to it to see where I got my takes from. So without further ado, let's see who comes out on top, the 8th wonder of the world, or the New World's Relentless Ruffian. Starting with Kong, I'm willing to bet most of you are familiar with the VSB calcs, placing the ape at small building level. However, most of you aren't aware that a set of recalcs of these feats exists, with a different methodology that seeks to see how much energy the ape would have exerted with its head. All in all, upscaling the ape to large building level with an energy yield from 119 kilograms to up to 2 tons of TNT. If you're feeling generous, you could create some sort of composite of 2005 Kong that takes advantage of all the related media based on the film, regardless of continuity errors. If you do end up taking that route, you could add Kong's in-game feat of slugging a massive stone pillar and his Reign of Kong feat of smashing through some ruins, both of which come out to nearly 1 ton of TNT, adding more consistency to the large building level meta. Going back to more canon sources, the 8th wonder of the world can also be seen crushing a V-Rex skull with a 20-ton boulder. Keep in mind the ape did this single-handedly, meaning it's far from his maximum bench press. No wonder Kong can throw around V-Rexes so effortlessly, as their isometric scaling places them a little over 17 metric tons. Even their volumetric analysis places them at just over 24 metric tons. I've also partaken in some calcs of my own, finding that the King's bite force at a minimum is over 68 kilonewtons, and scaling this feat right here to 623 megajoules, or the equivalent of 149 kilograms of TNT. Beyond that, Kong just has a plethora of small building level feats, so let's move on to our next combatant. Anjanath is a little more complex to scale. Going off Tyrannosaurs, the Wyvern's bite force would yield nearly 146.63 kilonewtons of force and output over 234.77 kilojoules of energy. However, we can scale the Fierce Jaw Wyvern's bite force to be much higher than this, as in its turf war with Great Jagras, we see the brute thrashing about the helpless fanged wyvern. Given how this feat is performed, you could scale the wyvern's jaws to deliver over 2.75 meganewtons of force and output just over 4.4 megajoules of energy. However, all of this is still likely massive downplay, as Anjanath can be seen competing with apex tier monsters. I won't get into all the nuances of what it means to be an apex tier monster, as this video is already plenty long enough as it is, and I imagine most of you would have diegetically absorbed what it means by playing the games. Whilst Anjanath is undoubtedly weaker than this tier of monster, he can still give them a good fight, as shown in his Rise Turf Wars, which while he loses, he still manages to perform in. And before any of you say these are lazily copy and pasted turf wars from Fulgur, even if they are, not only are they still canon, but also fit quite nicely with Anjanath's narrative, as he's outright stated to be the apex of the ancient forest when Rathalos isn't around, showing he's on the cusp of becoming that tier of monster. Why is this important? Well, it's because these monsters have multiple large building level calcs that Anjanath would scale to. Obviously, as shown by Rathalos' Turf War and Diablos' cutscene in Rise, the Brute Wyvern is on the low end of that spectrum, more so when it comes to durability, as its iron hard scales simply don't cover enough of its body when compared to its soft translucent skin. However, Anjanath has one last secret weapon that can help him stay competitive with these monsters. Once backed into a corner, Anjanath will initiate the fired up state, in which he gains the ability to wield the fire element. Not only do his fights get a little boost by being able to inflict burn damage on its victims, but he also gains the ability to spew a torrent of fire. This fiery breath is a byproduct of a mucus solution produced internally by Anjanath. Using a fuel analog, I managed to calc this breath attack to anywhere between 3.64 to 6.64 gigawatts, or the equivalent of 871.1 kilograms to 1.59 tons of TNT per second. This torrent is energetically demanding, thus Anjanath is reserved and calculating when using it. With our two combatants appropriately scaled, it's easy to see why this isn't a one-sided stomp. Both reach similar ends, albeit Anjanath's scaling is a little more robust than Kong's. Either way, in a straight up melee brawl, I favor the Wyvern overall, thanks to its much more robust set of weaponry. However, Kong isn't an idiot, and the strategies he's developed to fight V-Rexes will work wonderfully against the Wyverns. More so, his ability to use the terrain towards his advantage, as simply smashing nearby objects on the Wyvern's face won't work too well, with the brutes being shown shrugging off boulders similar to the ones that killed the adolescent V-Rex. Thus, I think experienced Megaprimatus males like Skull Island's Lonely King could protect their troops from these invasive wyverns by mapping out their territories and luring out the tenacious carnivores into death traps. Less experienced males, or those caught off guard, however, are in for a bad time. Thus, I think the apes would come to fear and hate the wyverns in the same way they did the V-Rexes of old. And with that, we finally come to the end of our video. Having traversed through all of Skull Island's passageways, Anjanath gains a 7 out of 10 for environmental suitability. Overall, his arboreal and thermal regulatory adaptations really help him adapt to Skull Island's rugged terrain and tropical weather. Yet his need for open spaces in order to hunt keeps him from truly thriving in most regions. From giant sauropods to tiny arthropods, Skull Island's menagerie of life offers much in the way of food. That's if you're strong enough to capitalize on it. Anjanath's tenacious attitude earns him a 6.7 out of 10 score for prey acquisition, mostly brought down by the lack of suitable prey items in the chasms that crisscross the island. However, this shouldn't detract from the fact that in certain regions on the island, Anjanath is feasting. Finally, when it comes to competitors/predators, adult Anjanath have little to fear. Only a group of V-Rexes or submerged Pteranodon could make the wyverns think twice, which is a substantial upgrade from their life back home in the ancient forest. Whilst juvenile Anjanath are susceptible to predation and face steep competition, this likely isn't anything new for the wyverns. Also, lots of these competitors could turn into potential prey options in the future. It's for all that I award the brutes with a 9 out of 10 score for dealing with competitors/predators, earning the New World's Relentless Ruffian a final score of 7.6 out of 10. Whilst definitely a challenging quest, I do believe Anjanath could overcome the challenges of Skull Island and establish itself as the new apex predator. And that's all I've got for today, folks. If you liked what you saw, consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the channel, as this helps the channel grow and it helps me bring you more videos like this. If you really like what you saw, then consider watching these videos Google says you'll like. Other than that, have a lovely rest of your day.